morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Ineke. I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here. And I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to attend this event. So with that, I'm excited to dive into today's topic, so let's begin. The Rhinoceros by Eugene Ionesco in 1960, considered to be one of the seminal plays of the theater of the absurd, is set in a small French town where the residents start turning into rhinoceros. The protagonist, Berenger, initially dismisses the transformation as absurd and impossible. However, as more and more people in the town are turned into rhinoceros, he realizes that they embrace the transformation and begin to see the rhinoceros as beautiful, strong, and noble animals. Berenger is afraid as he sees his friends either turning into rhinoceros as becoming tolerant towards them, yet he cannot accept this situation, particularly the fact that communication becomes impossible with these animals, their roars being meaningless. The final scene depicts Berenger standing alone in despair against everyone else who has turned into rhinoceros. The play ends with Berenger's cry, "I'm not capitulating," leaving the audience to ponder his fate. Is his resistance futile against such an overwhelming force? Is his refusal a symbol of hope and resilience against the force of tyranny? The play explores themes of conformity, complicity, and resistance in the face of the 20th century's authoritarianism, and captures a society's gradual shift into complicitous accommodation to systematically violent regimes. As political theorist Michael Lamihai explains, the play is a direct comment on the seduction of exclusionary, poisonous, and violent ideologies and regimes such as authoritarianism, racism, and fascism, raising many questions about how someone becomes a perpetrator, an accomplice, or a bystander to political violence. The play shows that what several countries in Europe have experienced, especially during the 20th century, that is how slowly but gradually large parts of a population slide into conformity and accommodation to systemic violence. It is remarkable to notice nowadays that similar events seem to be happening once again in the European continent and other parts of the world, with the rise of authoritarianism and right-wing populism. Ionesco's play provides a good point of departure for reflecting on issues of complicity with systemic violence and what might be the role of education in these political circumstances. What kinds of lessons can be learned from stories of complicity with and resistance to political violence and social injustice? How should such stories be covered or recovered in education, and what do they have to teach us, educators, scholars, policymakers, students, about present-day struggles against political violence and social injustice? In particular, what does it mean to teach students to resist systemic violence and take an anti-complicit stance when everyone seems to be already embedded in institutions that exert or sustain political violence, rendering us as potential perpetrators, accomplices, or bystanders? I would argue that there are two important lessons about complicity and resistance emerging from Ionesco's play that offer crucial insights for my approach in this talk on understanding structural violence and analyzing the role of education in addressing it. First, grappling with complicity is a complex task involving a deeper understanding of how routinized, unreflective everyday acts, which are related to many factors such as personal ambition and motives, modes of thinking and feeling, power structure, social norms, and so on, contribute to the formation and reproduction of what I call an affective political ecology of structural violence. The idea of complicity that usually dominates public imaginary, as well as certain academic circles, is an atomistic one. Namely, complicity is a matter of individuals' fault. However, Ionesco's play highlights the relational and structural nature of complicity, namely its entangled affective political nature, foregrounded in the ways that an individual, as a member of a group, becomes complicit to forms of sociality that normalize wrongdoing. In this sense, the role of education in exposing, problematizing, and even opposing this relational and structural nature of complicity is crucial. And I will share some ideas how to do this towards the end of my talk. Second, Ionesco's play also provides us with an account of resistance, which enables us to think about complicity and resistance not as a binary, but rather as a continuum of positions that individuals occupy in their everyday lives. In other words, there is no metaphysics of purity, to use Alexis Shortworth's expression, in manifestations of resistance or complicity. Both resistance and complicity can only be accounted for, argues Mihai, by reflecting on agents' positionality within the social world, each agent being located at the intersection of several axes of distinction such as class, gender, racialization, or religion. These axes make possible different forms of intersubjective relationality. Mihai suggests that there is an interplay between individual socially mediated positionalities and the affective politics in which individuals and groups are embedded. Positionalities then need to be understood relationally, dynamically, and temporarily. It is precisely this embeddedness in social groups that influences individuals' participation in acts of complicity with structural and political violence. In my research over the years on how to make sense of the concepts of complicity and resistance, I'm constantly reminded of this entanglement of complicity and resistance, and especially their complex manifestations in different eras and socio-political contexts. In Nazi Germany and European countries under Nazi occupation, in colonized countries, authoritarian regimes, the war in Gaza, and so on. These manifestations of complicity and resistance have political and pedagogical implications that are crucial in two ways. First, at its core, the entanglement of complicity and resistance highlights that positionality, which has come at the center of recent academic debates, cannot be understood in essentialist terms, but rather through intersectional, racialized, nationalized, gender, and class lenses, connecting us to difficult histories such as settler colonialism, genocide, slavery, or totalitarianism. Second, the entanglement of complicity and resistance cannot be understood without situating them within a particular affective politics. The dominating feeling rules, to use Arlie Hochschild's term, that make up the backdrop against which this entanglement operates contribute to the construction of these very positionalities themselves. Both of these caveats, I argue, offer new theoretical insights for understanding complicity and exploring the political and pedagogical potential of nurturing what I call an anti-complicit stances, what I call anti-complicit complicit stances, as well as shared complicities in education. Now, my talk is divided into these 4 parts. I will say a few things about the different manifestations of complicity, then the entanglement between complicity and resistance, what I call the affective political approach. Then I will go into an example of complicity in the context of my own country to show what I mean. And then I will conclude with the notions of anti-complicity and shared complicities, especially their pedagogical implications. Now, since the 2000s, to begin with the first part of the talk, since the 2000s, there has been an increasing number of books, edited volumes, and special issues of academic journals in different fields, including political science, law, history, memory studies, literature, and education, exploring complicity. These works are roughly divided into 2 categories. On the one hand, there are those focusing on the individual responsibility of someone in moral or legal wrongdoing, the so-called atomistic conception of complicity, and on the other hand, there are those paying attention to the structural circumstances within which acts of complicity take place, the structural and or political conception of complicity. Regardless of the different definitions or theoretical lenses used to understand complicity, there is nonetheless a common ground shared by most, namely that complicity entails a contribution to wrongdoing. In other words, complicity is not considered a primary, but rather a secondary act of wrongdoing. In this sense, those who are complicit contribute to wrongdoing rather than fully participate in it. In the interest of time, I will discuss here briefly the notion of structural complicity that is central to my argument, and give an example of a concept that sees the structural and the personal as entangled rather than as dichotomous complicities. In structural complicity, an agent's complicity is not limited to the interpersonal sphere, nor to a discrete act of wrongdoing, but rather is assessed on the basis of the relations between an agent and the unjust social structures in which they find themselves. Examples of structural complicity are marked by an agent's involvement in structural injustice. That is, those practices, norms, and ways of life that emerge from complex patterns of social interaction and that systematically privilege some while disadvantage others. For example, white complicity, which is usually defined as the ways in which white people perpetuate often unintentionally systemic racial injustice, is a case of structural complicity. As Barbara Applebaum shows in her influential work, white complicity is manifested in education through white students' denial and resistance to acknowledge their role in race and racism. White complicity does not step from any particular individual act, but is rather a product of the very structures of racial injustice that position some people, whites, as privileged and others, black, indigenous, and peoples of color, as underprivileged. Michael Rothberg's recent concept of the implicated subject may be seen as an example of complicity that combines the individual and the structural. This concept is helpful in thinking about complicity in relation to difficult issues in education because it explores how subjects are implicated in historical and contemporary structures of violence, oppression, and injustice. In my view, the implicated subject is an example of complicity that shows how the subject contributes to and inhabits affective regimes of injustice that not only benefit the subject, but can also be harmful to them at the same time. For example, someone may be a victim of injustice in one context, while they may be complicit with wrongdoing in another context. To illustrate this, Rothberg provides a personal example by addressing the complex relationship of Jewish diaspora to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, in which overlapping histories of genocide and oppression intersect. Some Jewish intellectuals, for example, Judith Butler, have made public interventions to highlight the complexities around the interlocking positions of complicity and resistance. Importantly, both the notion of complicity and that of the implicated subject acknowledge that not everyone is implicated or is complicit equally or in the same manner. Therefore, responsibility for structural injustice is not evenly distributed. In the next part of my talk, I analyze further the complicity-resistance continuum to clarify how complicity is socially and politically embedded within structures of violence. In the essay, The Gray Zone, from his book, The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi draws on his personal experiences as a prisoner in the Auschwitz concentration camp to raise concerns about the conventional ways of recognizing heroes who resist and villains who are perpetrators or accomplices. When we try to make sense of structural violence and organized atrocity using binaries, such as hero versus villain, or resistance versus complicity, says Levy, then it becomes difficult to recognize the systemic and institutional logics that create structures of violence, inhibiting resistance while enabling complicity. Levy's essay is generally read as a response to debates on the challenges of assessing complicity and resistance framed around the question often addressed to survivors of the Holocaust or survivors of other atrocities and authoritarian regimes. Why didn't you resist? When victims are asked why they didn't resist, argues Levy, it's like accusing them for complicity, while undermining the gravity of the harm they suffered. Levy's response is that there is a gray zone of complicity that makes it difficult to recognize or confront forced complicity as a form of violent abuse that is also highly effective as a strategy for prolonged subjugation. There are gray zones of complicity, according to Levy, because cases of resistance and complicity are much more nuanced, complicated, and overwhelming than we often assume. To understand the gray zone, points out Rothberg, means to accept that complicity is marked by shades or degrees. Forced complicity, according to Levy, which was abundant in the Nazi concentration camps, think about Kapo prisoners, for example, is a devastating form of abuse because it destroys one's capacity to resist and shames its victims into silence. Conflating forced complicity with other forms of complicity, points out Levy, results in erasing the nuances in resisting violence and injustice. Therefore, complicity and resistance are much more entangled than one may initially think. In some cases, victims are forced into complicity, while in other cases they may resist. The relationships between complicity and resistance is one of continuum rather than a binary. Mihai argues that there is a double erasure when communities fail to recognize these complexities in understanding complicity and resistance. The first erasure happens when victim-perpetrator binaries perpetuate heroic mythologies while obscuring the social and political underpinning of violence. This understanding of complicity and resistance does not only produce an individualized account of events, for example, one is either a hero or a villain, but also enables the perpetuation of systemic exclusions and violent habits because it obscures the scale of collective involvement in political violence. At the same time, there is a second erasure at play. There is a fabrication and celebration of the category of so-called hero-elect, as, and I quote Mihai, unwavering, singular, usually male resistors whom the community should worship and honor for generations to come, end of quote. This canonization, writes Mihai, purifies resistors of all vulnerabilities and uproots them from the structures that makes their actions possible, while obscuring the contributions of those who do not fit this reductive profile. The implications of this double erasure are crucial in understanding complicity with and resistance to structures of violence. First, the community's political imaginaries seem to assume a metaphysics of purity, in understandings of complicity and resistance that focuses on exceptionality, while disavowing human relationality and structures of violence. However, as shown, this assumption is not only epistemologically and ontologically flawed, but also socially and politically narrow, because it subscribes to methodological individualism. Second, by reducing political violence into the characters of perpetrators, victims, heroes, and accomplices, the social structures of violence and their affective regimes remain unchallenged. In other words, there is a depoliticization of complicity and resistance, facilitating the reproduction of violent habits as the structures of violence get reproduced. Now, in inviting educators and researchers to embrace the ambivalent aspects of complicity and resistance in our explorations of political violence in education, I'm not only problematizing the prevailing metaphysics of purity, but also highlighting the significance of attending to the relationality that underpins the complicity-resistance continuum. My approach on complicity with wrongdoing then is driven not by a moralized or romanticized impulse that exalts resistors and damns accomplices, but rather by an affective political desire to sharpen our analytical tools of thinking through complicity while exploring the shape that an affective politics of solidarity might take and the obstacles it might face in educational spaces. Problematizing, therefore, the double erasure identified before in the context of education is at the center of efforts to challenge the national myth-making that is perpetuated in Europe and beyond in narratives about heroes and villains, perpetrators and victims, accomplices and resistors. I live in a country and a region that feels in its bones the messy aftermath of political violence. The past inter-ethnic violence between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots in Cyprus, the ongoing political conflict in Israel and Palestine, to the extent that we, and by we I mean educators and researchers, become aware of the positionalities and relationalities that fuel complicity with political violence and those that nurture practices of resistance against it, I argue that we will be better able to work in the field of education and other realms of social and political life on reducing future political violence. Obscuring complex complicities and impure resistances from official memory, reminds us Mihai, enables systemic forms of violence, such as the militarization of schools and the society, systemic bias and discrimination against national others, binaries between we, the victims, and they, the perpetrators, in all realms of social and political life, to continue unchallenged and become reproduced in new forms. My discussion here takes on an issue that emerges from my own personal experiences. First, growing up as a student and then as a former elementary school teacher in ethnically divided Cyprus, namely how the Greek Cypriot educational system is complicit with structures of violence that reproduce victim-perpetrator binaries. I talk about the Greek Cypriot educational system because this is the system within which I grew up and did research. However, there is similar evidence from research conducted by Turkish Cypriot colleagues in the Turkish Cypriot community. In my long-term ethnographic research on the affective politics of the Greek Cypriot educational system during the last 2 decades, I have documented how a particular education policy called "Δεν ξεχνώ," which means "I don't forget," nurtures grand narratives about Greek Cypriots as victims of Turkish aggression, while obscuring ideas, practices, forms of sociality, and affective registers that recognize the violence, dispossession, and suffering experienced by the Turkish Cypriot community as well. The education policy of "I don't forget" has become prominent in the Greek Cypriot educational system in the years after the Turkish invasion of 1974 that divided the country into the Turkish-occupied north and the Republic of Cyprus government-controlled south. This policy aims at teaching Greek Cypriot children and youth to remember the occupied territories and cultivate their national identity and will to struggle for the liberation of occupied territories. My analysis over the last 20 years has demonstrated that the affective political orthodoxies that have been set up both in the policy of "I don't forget" and its practice in schools and the society memorialize heroic sacrifice and nurture particular emotions and affects, such as the feelings of victimhood, grief and injustice for the Greek Cypriot community, while obscuring or preventing feelings of empathy for the Turkish Cypriot suffering. Therefore, when I argue that the Greek Cypriot educational system is complicit with political violence, I understand complicity as both structural and personal. Complicity is a structural relationship that cannot be easily tackled because it exists in multiple networked forms in the community, in government, kinship, and so on. Complicity is also personal in the sense that the educational system and its agents, teachers, students, policymakers, and so on, reinforce their own unfreedom because they contribute to perpetuating a world in which victim-perpetrator binaries limit possibilities of transcending structures of violence and nurturing resistance to it. However, how can we, educators, researchers, formulate a critical account of complicity with political violence and nurture practices of resistance to it when we are already implicated in the world we critique? I have argued so far that to comprehend the complex dynamics of complicity, we must account for the agent's positionality, a function, and I quote Mihai, a function of processes of subjectification that influence her experiences and their sedimentation in memory, her hopes for the future, and the role she ascribes to her own agency in bringing about that future. End of quote. When institutions, education for example, are grounded in exclusionary ideas that are anchored in agents' minds, emotions, and bodies, the issue of complicity cannot be tackled unless we expose how a society's imaginary sustains and reproduces structures of violence. For example, revealing how a community becomes insensitive to victims of violence because they come from another community or another social group, or self-righteously exalts the victims of its own community as heroes, quote unquote, is a form of complicity with violence that needs to be identified as such. It is important, though, to do this not in order to instill guilt, but rather to show how the dire consequences of the link between insensitivity and complicity contribute to a world of sustained violence. I move now to the last part of my talk. The fundamental pedagogical and political question that drives my discussion in this last part of my talk is how to engage critically in ways that minimize our complicity with political violence through education, as avoiding complicity altogether, I think, is impossible. As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, we are implicated in the worlds we critique. Being critical does not suspend any such implication. In his contribution to recent debates on complicity, Alexander Christoyanopoulos phrases the question of critical engagement as follows. How can our imagination be engaged critically in order to come to terms and resist our own complicity with systemic violence? In other words, how can we embrace, for lack of a better word, complicity in the sense of forming the grounds for political responsibility that challenges the reproduction of systemic violence, for example, through education and other realms of social and political life? Christoyanopoulos' answer, which I find relevant to education, is through defamiliarization, a conceptual tool, if you will, meant to shake individuals, and I quote, into recognizing the absurdity of common justifications of violence, admitting their implicit complicity in it, and noticing the process which numbed them into accepting such complicity, end of quote. Christoyanopoulos theorizes defamiliarization in the context of literature, as the process of making the familiar strange, breaking down its components, and reassembling them again, as if seen through the eyes of a child for the first time. To do so, Christoyanopoulos shows how Tolstoy successfully deployed defamiliarization in his works to denounce entrenched practices of violence in Russia, such as flogging, deportations to Siberia, and imprisonment. Similarly, the social, affective, and political norms that reproduced violence in the educational system of conflict-affected societies, such as Cyprus or Israel, the militarization of schools, heroic national mythologies that exalt death and sacrifice, binaries of victims and perpetrators, are rendered questionable through defamiliarization. Defamiliarization is potentially subversive, according to Christoyanopoulos, for 4 reasons that you can see there in the slide. It disrupts routine thinking and briefly opens a moment for reflection. It helps establish some implicit agreement on what is being observed through the complicit bond that underlies the sharing of humor, irony, or ridicule. It relativizes constructed hierarchies and strips them of their self-importance, and it generates empathy. Thus, those who are hypnotized by habit and fail to see acts of violence and oppression for what they are, he says, are encouraged to critically reflect on the ways they have succumbed to forms of complicity with state-sponsored and ideologically sanctioned violence. Along with the use of literary works, Mihai also proposes that certain artworks may also work subversively, as they, and I quote, can seductively sabotage reductive narratives about what happened by prosthetically enabling audiences to see the world of systemic violence in its complexity, from different points of view, and as it changes over time, end of quote. Yet there is another important distinction here that is crucial, especially for educational efforts to deal with complicity. One's ignorance for their own complicity can be a matter of automated, habituated perception, but there can also be a willed ignorance that renders one complicit. Willful ignorance means that individuals choose their ignorance when faced with unpleasant truths they are unwilling to admit. For example, in relation to race, Charles Mills tells us that white ignorance is a form of willful ignorance because it invests in the perpetuation of white privilege. Similarly, ignorance of the other's vulnerability in the context of difficult histories, such as in the case of Cyprus and Israel-Palestine, is often a willful political choice. For example, if social and political institutions, schools for example, communicate the message that only one owns group deserves to be grieved and others are ungrievable, to use Judith Butler's term, then this amounts to a form of complicity with political violence. To come back to the question with which I started my discussion here. So, what education and educators can do to engage students critically in ways that minimize complicity with political violence. There has been a growing literature in recent years around the issue of complicity in educational scholarship. In particular, Barbara Applebaum's landmark work has paved the way in showing the pedagogical challenges of responding to white students' denials of complicity in the classroom and advocates for what she calls white complicity pedagogy. That is, pedagogies that encourage white students to acknowledge their complicity and unearned privilege. Applebaum's proposition for a white complicity pedagogy aims to develop in students vigilance for identifying and exposing the ways in which whiteness makes itself invisible in order to protect the status quo. In her more recent work, Applebaum suggests the need to cultivate what she calls a vigilantly vulnerable informed humility to address white complicity in the classroom. Her crucial point is that it is impossible to transcend whiteness and bringing into sharper critical focus without cultivating humility, acknowledging vulnerability, and nurturing vigilance. Building on Applebaum's work, I have also put forward the idea of an anti-complicity pedagogy. That is, pedagogical practices inspiring anti-complicit actions that actively resist social and political harm in everyday life. Here I want to expand this notion by providing further clarifications to the idea of nurturing an anti-complicit stance in education in conjunction with the notion of shared complicities. Namely, the idea that we cannot avoid complicity in the world. Therefore, it is important to get detached from the idea that we are not implicated subjects in wrongdoing. Importantly, shared does not mean the same. There are many asymmetries in shared complicities, as there are many positionalities. Both anti-complicity and shared complicities are concepts that provide us with useful analytical tools to understand the nuances of complicity with political violence, as well as our political responsibility as educators and researchers to sensitize teachers, students, parents, and policymakers about these nuances. In particular, pedagogies that foster anti-complicity and/or shared complicities offer ways for rethinking how teachers and students are situated, albeit asymmetrically, in interlocking systems of violence, oppression, and injustice that have always historical dimensions. As James Miles points out correctly, and I quote, "This is not to suggest that teachers should label all students implicated subjects or ask students to declare their implications to the class. Such an approach is potentially harmful and will not suffice in dealing with the issue," end of quote. Rather, anti-complicit education that aims to foster subjectivities that take a markedly anti-complicit stance or recognize that complicities are shared yet not the same might be seen as providing pedagogical spaces for students to rupture the naturalized truths and unquestioned binaries of victim-perpetrator that suffuse them. In other words, a pedagogy that is anti-complicit or fosters an orientation of shared complicities constitutes an alternative space of vigilance and humility that tenders the subject, teacher, or student immune to the disciplining sanctions of the hegemonic affective regime that promotes violence. It is crucial that this space recognizes the experiences of vulnerabilities, especially those who are less privileged, and evokes feelings of solidarity that challenge heroic mythologies and victim-perpetrator narratives, binaries. These asymmetries of complicity raise important questions for future research, such as those that I have in the slide. I will not read them. And to conclude now, framing a critical understanding of complicity through the lens of an affective political approach, such as the one I sketched here, leaves us, educators, researchers, and so on, with both a political responsibility and a critical intellectual imperative to understand and contest systems of violence in which we are enmeshed. This requires not just an intellectual project of studying the role of education in challenging political violence, but rather a thoughtful set of political strategies that engage with those who subscribe to heroic mythologies and victim-perpetrator binaries. Prescriptions may be less helpful here than effective starting points. To begin rethinking complicity and resistance, to start with non-innocent positionalities, to begin reconsidering our monolithic categories of victim and perpetrator, to fully enact such a political and pedagogical task means exploring how to relinquish the conventional justifications of political violence in education and the society at large. Thank you.